sun shone with a gentle persistence over the village of Much Combley, as though determined to grant the annual Lilac Lane Garden Society fate its due brilliance. Elderly ladies in floral frocks flitted between trestle tables laden with cucumber sandwiches, scones, and rhubarb cordial. Children darted about in various states of stickiness, chasing each other between hedgerows. There was music, a warbling phonograph near the gazebo, and the faint clink of teacups in porcelain saucers as polite conversations fluttered like bunting in the June breeze. To the outsider, it was idyllic, but those who knew the village well could spot the undercurrents. Mrs. Agatha Draycott had not spoken a word to Mrs. Beryl Flint since the unfortunate incident with the jam recipe last autumn. Young Harold Smeaton's awkward courtship of prim Evelyn Collett was being watched with barely concealed glee by the older women like spectators at a genteel tennis match. And behind her pleasant smile, the fate's hostess, Mrs. Lavinia Holbird, watched everyone with the quiet intensity of a general overseeing a battlefield. It was into this bucolic tension that Miss Marple arrived, precisely at 3:30 in a pale blue summer dress and an unobtrusive straw hat trimmed with navy ribbon. She came arm in arm with the vicar's wife, her lace gloves impeccably white, and her eyes quietly assessing. "Oh, Miss Marple," Lavinia said with gracious affection as she greeted them at the gate. "We were just saying we hoped you'd arrive in time for the sherry toast. A little early this year, I'm afraid. Colonel Halbert insists upon punctuality now that he's retired." "I shouldn't dream of missing it," Miss Marple replied gently, eyes flicking briefly to the colonel, who stood by the punch bowl with the self-satisfied air of a man recently liberated from officialdom. "Such a fine turnout, too. All of Lilac Lane seems to be here." "And one or two from beyond," Lavinia added with a slightly theatrical smile. "Do let me introduce you to our out-of-town guest, Mr. Archibald Sims. He's an old friend of the colonel's from his army days, visiting from London for the weekend. Quite the raconteur." Mr. Sims was tall and trim, with the polished assurance of someone used to club lounges and high-backed armchairs. His hair was silver, his manner easy. He bowed politely to Miss Marple, then looked out across the mingling crowd and said, with a curious glint in his eye, "Delightful scene, though I suspect, before this fete is over, someone will be dead." For a moment, silence fell around the tea table. Then came polite laughter, just the sort of reaction one might expect for a perfectly dry witticism. "Do forgive me," Mr. Sims said smoothly, waving a hand. "It's just an old habit. I used to dabble in crime fiction, purely amateur, of course. Years ago. I can't help spotting patterns, you know. Motives hanging about like laundry. Rather fun." Miss Marple tilted her head. "How intriguing," she said mildly, though her tone was nearly lost under the rustle of parasols and shifting garden chairs. She studied Mr. Sims for a moment longer before accepting her cup of tea. By 4:15, the fete was in full swing. The raffle had begun, and young Evelyn had won a basket of lavender soaps. Colonel Halbert stood smugly beside a towering Victoria sponge, announcing the winners of the jam competition. Mr. Sims was deep in conversation with Mrs. Flint about colonial India. Then came the scream. It was sharp and sudden, tearing through the soft, summery babble like a blade. People turned, dozens of them, towards the far end of the garden where the potting shed stood among roses and foxglove. A figure stumbled from behind the trellis, skirts muddied, face ashen. It was Nora Bristow, Lavinia Halbert's maid. Madam Lavinia," she stammered, staring wildly. She's in the shed. Oh, Lord help, blood everywhere." Gasps erupted. Cups fell, chairs scraped. Miss Marple did not gasp. She quietly set her teacup down, eyes narrowing as she observed the sudden chaos unfold. Colonel Halbert rushed forward, followed by several braver souls. The vicar's wife murmured a prayer, and in the flurry of movement, Mr. Archibald Sims stood still, arms folded, looking toward the shed with an expression that could almost be described as expected. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him for a second longer than necessary. Then she turned and walked slowly toward the scene of the crime, as if heading to inspect a flower bed in bloom. She knew, though none else yet did, that the garden party had just become something altogether more sinister. The potting shed stood at the far end of the garden, shaded by an arch of overgrown honeysuckle and half swallowed by ivy. It had once been a practical space, used for pruning, potting, and Lavinia Halbert's somewhat obsessive bulb cataloguing, but now it had become a grim centerpiece. Colonel Halbert reached it first, pushing the old wooden door open with the military efficiency of a man trained for sudden shocks. The others, a mixture of curious neighbors and horrified guests, hung back a few paces. Miss Marple, however, continued forward at a steady, unhurried pace, arriving just in time to glimpse the interior before someone thought to shut the door. Lavinia Halbert lay slumped on the floor beside an upturned tray of flower pots and broken ceramic labels. Her hat, still perched askew on her head, was soaked in a dark stain. A hand trowel lay just inches from her gloved fingers, no longer a tool of cultivation, but, evidently, of violence. The sharp edge was tinged with red. "Oh, my poor Lavinia," Colonel Halbert murmured, though his voice lacked the depth of grief. It was more stunned than sorrowful, his mouth forming the words before his mind had caught up. Nora Bristow, the maid, hovered at the threshold with trembling hands, clutched to her apron. Her wide, freckled face was pale, and she kept glancing over her shoulder, as though fearing the killer might be lingering still, hidden among the lilacs. Miss Marple's expression remained as placid as ever, though her eyes were alert, tracking every reaction, every word, every silence. She observed the scene for no more than a moment before stepping back and allowing others to fill the space with gasps, speculation, and questions. "Is she?" asked Mrs. Flint, clutching her handbag as though it might offer some defense. "Dead as Queen Anne," said Dr. Latimer, who had been summoned from the other end of the garden and had taken only a moment to examine the body before pronouncing the inevitable. Blunt trauma to the side of the skull. Could have happened minutes ago. Very deliberate. The crowd murmured. A few sobbed theatrically, though no one seemed quite sure how to mourn Lavinia Halbert. She had been respected, certainly, even admired in some corners, but never universally loved. It wasn't long before the constable arrived. Constable Fred Cummings, young and fresh-faced, had not yet earned the full trust of much Combley's older residents, who felt his moustache was too thin and his shoes too new. He tried to assert control as best he could, clearing people away from the shed, ordering the garden sealed, and scrawling notes in a small leather notebook. "Right. No one leaves until I've spoken to everyone," he announced, trying not to look overwhelmed. "Dr. Latimer, if you wouldn't mind staying. Miss Bristow, Nora, is it? I'll need your statement first." Miss Marple drifted away from the commotion, back toward the half-abandoned tea tables where a few uneaten cucumber sandwiches remained balanced on lace doilies. She took a seat with delicate grace, folding her hands over her reticule and appearing to any casual observer merely a slightly tired elderly lady. Only she wasn't tired. Her mind, as keen as the shears in Lavinia's prized rose garden, was already turning over every detail. Mr. Archibald Sims appeared beside her, holding 2 cups of lukewarm tea and offering one without comment. "How very shocking," he said at last, as though the words had only now occurred to him. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, taking the tea but not drinking it. "A great pity. Mrs. Halbert was very particular about her flowers. It's a strange sort of person who could raise dahlias and murder in the same pair of gloves." Sims tilted his head, amused. "You're quite observant, Miss Marple. I do wonder what you make of it." She gave him a demure smile. "Oh, nothing much. only that Mrs. Halberd would never have allowed her gardening shed to become so disordered. It suggests a struggle, you know, or perhaps something unexpected, and Nora Bristow doesn't strike me as the fainting sort. No? Sims asked, his eyes narrowing with interest. She was once in service in one of the larger homes in Hampshire, I believe. According to her aunt, who sings in the church choir, Nora once calmly swept up after a pheasant shooting accident involving a footman and a misplaced blunderbuss. Sims chuckled. You really are remarkable. Miss Marple blushed faintly, though her gaze remained sharp. Oh, I simply pay attention. People are really very consistent, you know, even when they try not to be. At that moment, Constable Cummings approached them with an air of frustrated duty. Miss Marple, Mr. Sims, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to speak with each of you. Nothing formal, you understand? Just establishing timelines, that sort of thing. Of course, dear, Miss Marple said, rising with serene dignity. But you'll want to speak with Mr. Smeaton and Miss Collett too. They were walking behind the lilac bushes, not 20 yards from the shed. Cummings blinked. Were they? I hadn't, thank you, Miss Marple. She moved aside, letting Sims go first, and took a moment to wander over toward the empty raffle table. There, as she had quietly noted earlier, a small stack of leftover prize tags lay undisturbed, except for one that had been torn precisely in half. Odd, she murmured, how people always overlook paper. By early evening, the fete had transformed entirely. The bunting still fluttered in the breeze, but now it did so above a scene of suspicion and whispered conversations. The constable had done his best to corral the guests into the vicarage garden next door, but the air was restless. The village, like any living organism, was adjusting, already weaving the murder into its rhythm. Speculation swelled in low murmurs. I heard Nora Bristow had been caught stealing silverware last year, someone whispered. I'd wager it's the colonel. Retired men often go strange. I'm telling you, it's that London man. Knew it would happen before it did, didn't he? Miss Marple said nothing, though she listened carefully. She found herself standing beside Miss Evelyn Collett not long after supper had been delivered to the gathered villagers, cold ham and pickled onions from the vicar's wife, served in silence. Evelyn looked pale and unusually flustered, though she tried to maintain composure. Such a tragedy, she murmured, stirring her tea without drinking it. I always thought Mrs. Halberd had a sharp tongue, but no enemies, Miss Marple prompted gently. Evelyn glanced about before answering. Well, she had a way of knowing things, about people, and saying them too, when she thought it proper. I think she liked the power of it. And do you suppose she said something improper today? Evelyn hesitated. I don't know, but she did seem unusually tense. She kept looking at Mr. Sims as though she recognized him but couldn't place him. And then, just before the scream, Harold and I were near the roses. We heard her say something. She sounded quite angry, and then there was a sharp cry. What did she say? I don't recall exactly, Evelyn said. Just something like, You, what are you doing here? Miss Marple patted her hand. That's very helpful, dear. Memory is a peculiar thing. Best to say what you do recall, however small. She walked away slowly, her mind knitting together facts as deftly as she once embroidered linen. Lavinia Halberd had known something, or someone. Something she had not expected. Mr. Sims had made a remark before the death occurred, a casual prophecy. Nora's panic seemed calculated, if not entirely feigned. And that torn raffle ticket, an odd detail, easy to overlook. The threads were beginning to show, faint as spider's silk in the sun. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the smallest threads, if followed patiently, could unravel the tightest of knots. She sat again beneath the chestnut tree, quietly watching. Evening had fallen, and the lamps of much Comblé blinked to life, one by one, like knowing eyes. Somewhere nearby, the killer sat among them, sipping tea, answering questions, hiding behind the illusion of normalcy. And Miss Marple, still and silent as a shadow, was waiting for them to slip. The following morning dawned over Much Combley with the uneasy hush that settles after an unexpected storm. The fate decorations still clung to fences and trellises like ghosts of a happier day, and the scent of trampled grass mingled with a faint iron tang that clung stubbornly to the potting shed. Miss Marple awoke early, as was her habit, and took tea in her small sitting room, accompanied by a slice of plain toast and a mind already at work. Her housekeeper, Miss Knight, had barely begun dusting the mantel when the first knock of the day came, polite but urgent. It was Constable Cummings, hat slightly askew and face pinched with the weight of a case that had grown too complex for the straightforward world he preferred. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I wondered if I might trouble you for a moment." "Of course, dear," she replied, ushering him in and offering tea before he could politely refuse. "I was just about to enjoy a second cup myself. It's always helpful for thinking." He perched on the edge of a floral armchair, holding his notebook like a shield. "I've taken statements from nearly everyone, but things aren't lining up quite right. Thought perhaps you could help me fit the pieces." She gave a modest smile. "I should be happy to try." "First off," Cummings began, flicking through his notes, "the time of death. Dr. Latimer says Lavinia Halberd died no more than 5 minutes before Nora found her. But Nora says she was only gone a moment. Went to fetch more cordial, left Mrs. Halberd pottering about in the shed." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "And you find that troubling?" "I find it odd. For one thing, no one remembers seeing Mrs. Halberd leave the fete to go to the shed. It's not far, mind you, but she must have walked across the lawn. And if she didn't leave alone, well, no one saw her with anyone either." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It's curious indeed. But I wonder, Constable, did you happen to notice the flower pots near the body? Some of them were freshly broken." He blinked. "Well, yes. I assumed there was a scuffle." "Possibly. But Lavinia Halberd was meticulous about her gardening tools. She would never have allowed cracked pots to remain in her shed, not unless she had been taken entirely by surprise. It suggests the attack happened quite quickly. No argument, no shouting, just one moment. She was standing. And the next— Constable Cummings scribbled this down with a growing sense of unease. "That points to someone she wasn't afraid of, doesn't it? Or someone she didn't see coming at all," Miss Marple replied softly. They sat for a quiet moment, interrupted only by the clock on the mantel ticking out its measured beat. Then she added, "I also wonder, Constable, what you make of Mr. Sims." Cummings straightened. "Him? Well, that's another thing. The others noticed it too. He made that remark about someone dying just before the murder took place. Bit too theatrical, if you ask me. I've sent a telegram to London requesting more about his background. He claims he was in the military, but his story's thin." Miss Marple looked faintly pleased. "A wise precaution. People who pretend to be one thing often leave the smallest seam showing. I imagine Mrs. Halberd may have spotted one." Cummings snapped his notebook shut. "You think that's it, then? She knew something about him." "I think," Miss Marple said, rising and moving to the window, "that Lavinia Halberd spent a great deal of her time collecting secrets, like clippings for her garden journal, and secrets have a way of attracting danger." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way through the village with a purposefully leisurely gait. She stopped at the greengrocer, nodded to the vicar's wife outside the post office, and eventually arrived at the small cottage shared by Evelyn Collett and her ailing mother. Evelyn opened the door, her face drawn with the fatigue of unanswered questions and a poor night's sleep. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, surprised. "Please, do come in." Inside, the front sitting room smelled faintly of chamomile and coal dust. Mrs. Collett was asleep in a high-backed chair by the hearth, a shawl tucked neatly around her shoulders. "I won't stay long," Miss Marple assured her. but I did want to thank you for your help yesterday. It's such a difficult time, and you've been very brave." Evelyn smiled weakly. "I'm afraid I've not been very helpful at all. Everything just happened so fast." Miss Marple settled into a chair opposite her. "You said something about Lavinia, speaking just before the scream, that she seemed angry, that she said something like, 'What are you doing here?'" Evelyn nodded. "Yes, I remember that. I wasn't sure if it was connected. People do shout about all sorts of things." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed, her tone light. "But I do wonder, Evelyn, if you noticed what Mr. Sims did at that moment. You were nearby, after all." Evelyn blinked. "Mr. Sims? No, I don't think I saw him. Was he nearby?" "Only a few paces away by the herbaceous border. Odd that no one else seems to have noticed that, don't you think?" Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Now that you mention it, he did disappear just before it all happened. Then he reappeared so suddenly." "Indeed." Miss Marple's voice was thoughtful. "Like a rabbit from a conjurer's hat." She left the cottage a few minutes later with a polite farewell, mind a buzz. She had what she needed, just a nudge more to shake loose what lay hidden, and she had an idea of how to do it. That evening, Miss Marple invited Mr. Sims to take tea in her garden, citing a fondness for conversation and a jar of her late nephew Edward's favorite strawberry jam. He accepted with gracious flattery, appearing promptly at 4, wearing a crisp linen suit and the faintest air of self-satisfaction. They talked of roses, of art galleries in London, of the appalling service on the Great Western Line. All the while, Miss Marple poured tea and offered scones with clotted cream, her expression never betraying her thoughts. And then, quite suddenly, she said, "You know, I do think Lavinia recognized you." Sims froze for half a second, so slight that another person might not have seen it. His eyes remained on his cup, but something behind them shifted, like curtains drawn across a window. "Oh?" he said lightly. "And what makes you say that?" She was not a woman prone to outbursts, you know. That little moment before the scream, Evelyn Collett heard her say something to someone, and I rather think it was you. A man she had perhaps met before, perhaps during her husband's army years. Sims smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I fear you may be giving me too much credit. I only met the Halberds once or twice. I doubt she'd have remembered me." Miss Marple nodded. Unless there was something else to remember. Something not spoken of in polite company. A beat of silence passed. Then Sims laughed, the sound slightly too loud. "You're quite the amateur sleuth, Miss Marple." "Oh, not at all. I've simply found that people rarely forget the face of someone who's brought them disgrace, even after many years." Sims stood then, brushing crumbs from his trousers. "Well, I do thank you for the tea. And the jam. It's been most enlightening." As he walked away, his pace remained casual, but the set of his shoulders had changed. Miss Marple watched him go with quiet satisfaction. He had slipped, just slightly, but enough. She would not confront him. Not yet, but she now knew he was lying about something. The next step would be to discover why, and who else knew it. Evening fell again over Much Combley, and somewhere behind closed doors, a murderer began to realize that someone had noticed. The next morning brought a brittle light that filtered unevenly through the lace curtains of the vicarage sitting room. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner, a well-worn knitting basket in her lap, though her fingers remained still, idle for once as her mind pieced together the fragments of the investigation. The village seemed to hold its breath. Shutters were drawn, and even the birds sang with a cautious restraint. The constable had spent the night knocking on doors, gathering more statements, and attempting to corral gossip into coherent facts. But the threads were tangled, and the knot grew tighter by the hour. Miss Marple's quiet reflection was interrupted by a knock at the door, a gentle rap that heralded the arrival of Nora Bristow. The young maid's face was pale but determined. There was a new steadiness to her that Miss Marple found encouraging. Nora, do come in, she said, rising and guiding her guest to a chair by the fire. I thought I might see you today. Nora sat, clasping her hands in her lap. Thank you, Miss Marple. I wanted to talk about yesterday, about the shed. Miss Marple nodded. I'm all ears, dear. Nora took a deep breath. There's things I didn't say before, things I was afraid to mention. Nothing you say here will cause trouble, Miss Marple assured her gently. Sometimes the truth is the only way to untangle these things. Nora's eyes flicked to the window, then back. I was frightened, yes, but not of Mrs. Halberd, of someone else. Before the fete, I overheard something. Mr. Sims. He wasn't just a visitor. He was asking about the Colonel's old regiment and about money. I didn't think much of it at the time. But then, when I saw how Lavinia looked at him, it was like she knew him from before. Maybe from when Colonel Halberd was in India. Or Africa. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her knitting basket. Did you hear anything specific? Nora hesitated, then said, Yes. Mr. Sims mentioned accounts that need settling and debts that shouldn't be forgotten. It sounded like threats, but I thought he was joking. Did Mrs. Halberd say anything in reply? No, she just looked very pale and told him he was ill-advised. Then she hurried off. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. You're very brave to tell me this, Nora. I wanted to tell someone, Nora admitted. Because when I saw Mrs. Halberd fall, I knew it wasn't an accident, and I thought maybe Mr. Sims was involved. Miss Marple's eyes held a flicker of understanding. You have done well, my dear. Sometimes the smallest details can make the biggest difference. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the front door. Miss Marple rose and opened it to reveal Dr. Latimer, who carried his usual air of composed concern. Miss Marple, I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to speak with you about something unusual I discovered yesterday after examining Mrs. Halberd's belongings. Do come in, Doctor. They settled in the sitting room, and Dr. Latimer removed a small, folded piece of paper from his pocket. I found this in her handbag. It's a note written in a hurried hand. It reads, Meet me at dusk, by the old willow. We must settle before it's too late. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The old willow, you say? That's near the far end of the village green, just past the pond. Exactly, said Latimer. I asked around, but no one recalls seeing anyone there last evening. Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate. Would you mind if I took this with me? It might be worth a visit. By all means, Latimer said. I'll be here if you need me. The note folded carefully in her hand. Miss Marple set off toward the village green. The morning air was crisp, and the dew still clung to the grass. As she approached the ancient willow, its heavy branches swayed gently in the breeze, casting dark shadows over the damp earth beneath. She looked around carefully, noting a set of faint footprints leading from the pond to a narrow path behind the tree. Kneeling, she spotted something half buried in the moss, a small silver cufflink engraved with the initials H.S. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Curious, she murmured. Harold Smeaton, perhaps. Her thoughts raced back to the fete, and the brief conversation she'd had with Evelyn Collett about Mr. Smeaton's strange behavior and nervous glances. She pocketed the cufflink and turned back toward the village, where the afternoon was settling into a gentle lull. Back at the vicarage, she found Evelyn Collett in the garden, her hands busy with pruning shears, but her gaze distant. Evelyn, Miss Marple called softly, may I have a word? The younger woman looked up, surprised but willing. I found something near the old willow, a cufflink, silver with your husband's initials. Do you know how it might have gotten there? Evelyn's face went pale. I don't know. Harold sometimes loses things, but I don't recall this one missing. Miss Marple regarded her steadily. And were you with him yesterday afternoon? Evelyn hesitated, then said, No, Harold was elsewhere. but he is troubled, more than I've seen before." Miss Marple nodded, folding the cufflink into a handkerchief. "Thank you, Evelyn. Please don't leave town. I may have more questions soon." As Evelyn watched her go, a shadow of worry crossed her face. That evening, Miss Marple convened a small gathering at her home, inviting Colonel Halberd, Evelyn Collett, and Dr. Latimer under the pretext of seeking their counsel about the garden fete and the tragedy that had ensued. The atmosphere was tense but civil, each guest cautiously polite but watchful. Miss Marple began by recounting the discovery of the note and the cufflink, allowing the information to settle before watching their reactions. Colonel Halberd's jaw tightened, though he spoke with careful calm. "I have no idea what Mrs. Halberd was involved with. She was an enigma even to me sometimes." Evelyn's fingers trembled slightly as she looked at her husband's cufflink. "I don't know what this means. Harold has been distant lately. He's been worried about money. Debts, gambling, I think." Dr. Latimer interjected thoughtfully. "That might explain why Lavinia was so anxious yesterday. If Harold was in trouble, she may have been trying to protect the family name." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. But what troubles me is the note's urgency. Someone wanted to meet Mrs. Halberd in secret. Someone who may have threatened more than just scandal." The group fell silent, each considering their own private thoughts. After the guests left, Miss Marple sat by her fire, contemplating the tangled web that had begun to reveal itself. The secrets of much Combley were darker than they first appeared, and she sensed that the threads leading to the truth were intertwined with fear, deception, and desperation. She resolved to speak with Harold Smeaton next, to unravel the mystery behind the cufflink and the shadow it cast over the village's quiet life. As night deepened outside, Miss Marple prepared for the conversations to come, knowing that the true nature of the crime and the identity of the killer still lay hidden beneath the carefully cultivated surface of Much Combley. The morning mist hung low over Much Combley, softening the outlines of hedgerows and cottages alike. Miss Marple set off from her home with a purpose sharpened by the revelations of the previous evening. The weight of the silver cufflink in her pocket was a small but potent reminder of the complexities beneath the village's tranquil veneer. Harold Smeaton's house was a modest brick cottage on the edge of the village, its garden wild with untended blooms and weeds. She paused a moment on the path leading up to the front door, smoothing her skirt and adjusting her hat. The morning had a chill that suggested the lingering breath of early June. The door opened before she could knock, revealing Harold himself. He was a slender man, his hair prematurely graying, with eyes that darted nervously before settling on her with guarded suspicion. "Miss Marple," he said, attempting a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" She returned the smile, disarming and kindly. "I hope I'm not intruding, Harold. I wanted to speak about the fete, and more specifically, about this." She drew out the handkerchief containing the cufflink and held it delicately in her hand. His gaze flicked to it, and for a moment the mask slipped. A flicker of something unspoken, fear, guilt perhaps, passed across his face. I don't know how that came to be near the old willow. It's just a trinket, easily lost." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes narrowing just a little. "Indeed. But it's curious, is it not, that it should be found at the very place where a note was left for Mrs. Halberd, one that spoke of a secret meeting." Harold swallowed, his fingers clenching at his sides. "I've been under a good deal of stress lately, Miss Marple. There have been difficulties with money, but I swear I had nothing to do with that note or with what happened to Mrs. Halberd." She stepped inside when he opened the door wider, entering a room cluttered with unpaid bills and unopened letters. It was clear Harold's troubles were not merely imagined. "I'm sorry to hear that," Miss Marple said softly. "Money can drive people to desperate acts, but I don't think desperation alone explains this." Harold looked at her with sudden defiance. "Are you accusing me?" Not yet, she said, keeping her tone gentle. But I would like to know more about these debts. Who do you owe? And what sort of threats have you received? He hesitated, then nodded. There's a man, Mr. Collins. He's been pressuring me for weeks. Said if I don't pay soon, there'll be consequences. Miss Marple's mind whirred. Mr. Collins. She'd heard the name whispered at the fete, though no one had spoken of him openly. And did Mrs. Halberd know about this? Of course. She tried to keep it quiet, to protect Evelyn, but it was weighing on her, especially after Colonel Halberd's retirement. They were struggling more than they let on. Miss Marple rose as if to leave, then paused. One more thing, Harold. Were you aware that Mr. Sims was asking about these matters? About Colonel Halberd's regiment and unsettled accounts? Harold's face tightened. Sims. I didn't think he knew anything about me, or my troubles. But perhaps he did, Miss Marple suggested. And perhaps Mrs. Halberd recognized that, enough to warn him off. Harold closed his eyes briefly. I don't know what he's up to, but I want no part of it. Leaving Harold's cottage, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of the hunt tightening its grip. Each discovery peeled back another layer, revealing hidden fractures beneath much Combley's genteel surface. Her next visit was to the village's postmistress, Mrs. Wren, a woman known for her sharp eyes and penchant for detail. Miss Marple found her sorting letters behind the counter, a frown creasing her brow as she looked up. Miss Marple, how nice to see you. Is this about the dreadful business at the fete? Indeed, Miss Marple said, stepping inside. I was hoping you might recall if any letters arrived recently for Mrs. Halberd or Mr. Smeaton, especially anything unusual or urgent. Mrs. Wren tapped her chin thoughtfully. Now that you mention it, there was a letter for Mrs. Halberd just 2 days ago. Came from London, marked private and urgent. She collected it quickly, looked rather troubled. Do you still have it? Miss Marple asked eagerly. Mrs. Wren shook her head. Oh no, Mrs. Halberd took it with her, said she would reply at once. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. And Mr. Sims, anything come for him? Mrs. Wren's eyes narrowed. No, but he came in once to ask about the Halberds' address. Didn't say why, just that he wanted to pay them a visit. The pieces were edging closer. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Thank you, Mrs. Wren. You've been most helpful. She left the post office and walked slowly toward the village inn, where the local gossip gathered like bees to honey. Inside, the air was thick with chatter and the scent of peat smoke. At a corner table, she found Evelyn Collett again, seated with a cup of tea but looking far from settled. Evelyn, Miss Marple said softly, taking a seat beside her, I thought you might like some company. Evelyn smiled faintly, grateful for the kindness. Thank you, Miss Marple. It's been difficult, you know, with everyone looking at Harold so suspiciously. Miss Marple nodded. I understand. Sometimes the weight of suspicion can be heavier than the crime itself. Evelyn's hands twisted nervously. I wish I knew more. I don't think Harold meant harm, but the debts, the threats, they were real. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but probing. Do you know if Harold and Mrs. Halberd had any recent quarrels? Arguments that might explain the note or the urgency? Evelyn hesitated, then whispered. They did argue. Not loudly, but about money and secrets. Lavinia wanted to protect the family name, but Harold was desperate. It was a dangerous mix. Miss Marple considered this quietly. And Mr. Sims? Did he come to you as well? Evelyn looked away. He visited once, but I kept him at arm's length. There was something about him, too polished, too careful. Before Miss Marple could reply, the door opened and Constable Cummings stepped inside, his expression serious. Miss Marple, there's been another incident, he said. Mrs. Collett's mother was found outside her room, apparently pushed. She's shaken, but not badly hurt. The timing is suspicious. A hush fell over the table. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. This is no longer just about Mrs. Halbert's death. Someone is trying to silence or intimidate those who might uncover the truth. Cummings nodded. Exactly. I fear we're dealing with a clever and dangerous adversary. The village's peaceful mask was slipping away, revealing a darkness that threatened to consume more than one innocent life. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. Then we must proceed with care. The murderer is close, too close, and they will make mistakes. She looked around the room at the faces filled with worry and suspicion. Tell me, Constable, have you noticed anything unusual about Mr. Sims's whereabouts this morning? The constable frowned. Now that you mention it, he was seen leaving the village shortly after dawn, without saying goodbye. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. A hasty exit. Curious indeed. She rose, gathering her things. We shall see what secrets he hopes to bury by leaving, but I suspect his flight will be short-lived. Outside, the sun fought through thinning clouds as the village held its breath, waiting for the next move in this quiet, deadly game. Miss Marple walked steadily, her mind already threading the clues into a tapestry that would soon reveal the murderer's face. The village of Much Combley felt smaller now, its familiar paths shadowed by unease. News of the attack on Mrs. Collett's mother spread swiftly, and whispers bloomed like weeds in the market square and at the post office, yet the truth remained as elusive as the morning mist. Miss Marple began her day with a quiet visit to the Collett residence. The house, a modest but well-kept cottage near the churchyard, seemed to harbor more secrets than she had imagined. Mrs. Edith Collett sat in an armchair by the window, her hands tightly clasped over a shawl, eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and stubbornness. Mrs. Collett, Miss Marple said gently as she entered, I was sorry to hear about your fall. How are you feeling now? Edith gave a small, wan smile. A bit shaken, but I'll be fine. I suppose someone wanted to scare me, but it won't work. Miss Marple settled into the chair opposite her. Do you have any idea who might want to harm you? Edith shook her head. I don't know, but there's been tension in the village since Lavinia's death. Secrets aren't safe anymore. Were you aware of any quarrels Lavinia had before the fete? Miss Marple asked. Yes, Edith replied. There was talk of an argument between Lavinia and Harold Smeaton, but no one said much. Then there's Mr. Sims. He frightened me the most. He kept asking questions about old debts and the Colonel's regiment. I think Lavinia wanted to protect someone. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Mrs. Collett. Your courage in speaking will help us all. Leaving the cottage, Miss Marple's mind circled the name Sims. His departure from the village was suspicious, but he had left behind enough for her to pursue. She decided to call on the only person who might know more, the village's quiet librarian, Miss Agnes Reed, a woman whose love of records and history was as legendary as her discretion. At the small, ivy-covered library, Miss Marple found Agnes dusting shelves. She greeted Miss Marple with a warm smile. What brings you here this morning? I'm following a thread, Agnes, Miss Marple said, handing her the silver cufflink. Have you ever heard of a Harold Smeaton or of any dealings connected to Colonel Halbert's old regiment? Agnes took the cufflink, examining it closely. The name Smeaton is familiar, an old family from the area, but not of much standing nowadays. As for the regiment, Colonel Halbert was part of the King's Own Hussars, a distinguished unit. Do you have access to any records that might shed light on recent connections? Perhaps correspondence or notices? Agnes nodded and led her to a small, dusty reading room. Together they pored over letters and registers, their fingers tracing the faded ink. Among the documents, a folded telegram caught Miss Marple's eye. It was dated 2 weeks before the fete, addressed to Lavinia Halbert from an unknown sender, signed only with the initials H.S. The message was terse. We must meet. Matters cannot be postponed. The truth will come out otherwise. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured. Could this be Harold Smeaton? Agnes shrugged. Possibly, There are no further records of the meeting. Miss Marple carefully folded the telegram and slipped it into her handbag. As they were about to leave, Agnes mentioned quietly, "I've also heard from an acquaintance that Mr. Sims once served in the same regiment. A man with a past not quite as spotless as he'd like people to believe." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "That explains his interest. It seems the past is not so easily buried in much comble." Thanking Agnes, Miss Marple left, her thoughts turning to the shadowy figure of Mr. Sims. She decided to visit the village inn, hoping to gather information from those who had seen or spoken with him before his abrupt departure. The inn's common room was lively, but when Miss Marple entered, conversations tapered off. The landlord, Mr. Parker, greeted her with a nod. "Miss Marple, what can I do for you?" "Just a few questions about Mr. Sims, if you don't mind," she said, taking a seat near the fire. Mr. Parker leaned forward. "He was a strange one. Came here a few times last month. Asked lots of questions about the colonel and his family. Talked to several people, but never stayed long." "Did he seem nervous?" Miss Marple asked. "Aye, and secretive, like he was hiding something. And then last night he left in a hurry. Didn't pay his tab properly either." Miss Marple's brows knit together. "Did he speak of anyone in particular?" "Only about the colonel's old business. Something about debts and payoffs. Some say he was a soldier once, but with a past." The pieces fit into place like a puzzle finally coming together. Miss Marple thanked Mr. Parker and made her way toward the vicarage, the evening sky deepening with hues of lavender and gold. That night, as the village settled into uneasy quiet, a knock disturbed the peace of Miss Marple's sitting room. It was Constable Cummings, breathless and grim. "Miss Marple, there's been another development. Evelyn Collett's husband, Harold Smeaton, has been found in London. He claims he has information about Mrs. Halbert's death." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Tell me everything." Cummings pulled out a telegram. It read, "I am safe. I have proof. Must return at once. H.S." "Did he say where he has proof?" Miss Marple asked. "No, but he sounded desperate." The constable added, "He's been summoned back. I'm arranging transport for him." Miss Marple stood, steeling herself. The threads were tightening, the hidden truths pressing close. Harold Smeaton's return could unravel the entire mystery, or deepen the shadows that cloaked it. The next morning, Harold arrived, looking gaunt but determined. Miss Marple met him at the station, observing the weariness in his eyes, the slight tremor of his hands. "Harold," she said kindly, "thank you for coming back. We need to understand what you know." He nodded, taking a deep breath. "There's something I didn't tell before. The debts, the threats, they were the least of it. Mrs. Halbert was involved in something far more dangerous, something that reaches beyond this village." Miss Marple listened intently as Harold spoke of a hidden ledger, documents that implicated several influential figures in fraudulent military contracts during the colonel's service years. Lavinia had stumbled upon these secrets and feared their exposure. She tried to protect her family, Harold said bitterly, but someone didn't want the truth to come out. "Do you know who?" Miss Marple asked softly. Harold shook his head. "No, but I have this." He pulled a small, worn notebook from his coat pocket and handed it over. Miss Marple opened it carefully, noting the detailed accounts and names, some crossed out, some marked with ominous annotations. "It seems the danger was greater than we imagined," she said. "This ledger could explain many things." Harold looked up, hope mingling with fear. "If this comes out, it could destroy lives." Miss Marple nodded. "Sometimes the truth is a heavy burden, but it's the only path to justice." As the day wore on, the village buzzed with renewed curiosity and suspicion. The puzzle pieces were assembling, but the final picture remained just out of reach. Miss Marple, ever patient, prepared to watch and listen carefully, knowing that the quietest whispers often carried the loudest secrets. The true test was yet to come, and the next move would reveal whether the shadows of much Comble would finally be pierced by light, or deepen forever. Miss Marple sat quietly by the fireside that evening, the worn ledger open on the table before her. The low crackle of the flames mingled with the steady ticking of the clock, a measured rhythm that seemed at odds with the turmoil stirring in much Comble. The room was suffused with the scent of fading rosewood and freshly brewed tea. Yet beneath this comforting veneer lurked a tension Miss Marple felt keenly. Harold Smeaton had retreated to a spare room at her home for the night, a weary figure who looked as if the burdens of the last days had aged him considerably. His confession about the ledger and the hidden scandal had shifted the entire landscape of the investigation. Miss Marple had no doubt that the seemingly genteel village was now grappling with far-reaching shadows, and the delicate web of trust among its inhabitants was unraveling thread by thread. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Constable Cummings, carrying a small envelope. "Miss Marple, I thought you'd want to see this. It was slipped under my door early this evening." She took the envelope with a steady hand and slid her finger beneath the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting unmistakably precise and deliberate. "To Miss Marple, you meddle where you should not. Leave this matter alone, or there will be consequences you cannot foresee. A friend." Miss Marple folded the note carefully and placed it beside the ledger. "An ominous message," she murmured. "It appears our adversary grows restless." Cummings nodded, frowning. "I've been keeping watch around the village. Strange visitors have been spotted, and there are hushed conversations in corners that go silent when I approach." Miss Marple's eyes glinted with quiet determination. "That is to be expected. Fear and guilt often breed silence. But I find it curious that a friend should send such a warning. It implies proximity, perhaps even someone within much Comble itself." As night deepened, Miss Marple resolved to begin a series of discreet inquiries. The ledger, the threatening note, and the recent attack on Mrs. Collett's mother suggested that the murderer, or someone close to them, was intent on protecting secrets that had long been buried. The following morning, she set out with a list of villagers whose behavior had seemed peculiar in recent days. First on her list was Dr. Richard Fellows, the village physician, whose close friendship with Colonel Halberd and access to private information made him a figure of interest. She found him in his surgery, surrounded by medical books and the faint scent of antiseptic. "Good morning, doctor," she said, smiling warmly. "May I trouble you for a moment?" "Of course, Miss Marple," he replied, looking up from his notes. His demeanor was calm, though there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "I've been thinking about the ledger Harold brought. Do you know anything about these military contracts and the Colonel's dealings?" Dr. Fellows leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Colonel Halberd was a man of principle, but the military world is complicated. There were rumors of irregularities in some contracts, but nothing ever proven." Miss Marple nodded. "I see. Did you ever hear of any disputes involving Mr. Sims? He seems to have been connected to the regiment as well." The doctor frowned. "Sims? Yes, I recall. A rather shadowy character. He left under a cloud of suspicion several years ago. There was talk of financial improprieties, though I never had proof." Miss Marple's mind took note. "Thank you, Doctor. Your insight is most helpful." Next, she visited Mrs. Winifred Greaves, the village gossip whose sharp tongue was rivaled only by her keen air. Mrs. Greaves was in her garden, tending a row of bright hollyhocks, her eyes alight with anticipation at Miss Marple's arrival. "Miss Marple, I wondered when you'd come. Everyone's on edge, you know, and I hear tell Mr. Sims was seen near the manor last week, though no one will say why." Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "Did you hear any mention of Mr. Sims meeting with anyone?" "Whispered conversations, mostly. Some say he met with Lavinia just days before the fete. Others believe he was trying to retrieve something. perhaps the ledger. That would explain his sudden flight, Miss Marple murmured. Thank you, Mrs. Greaves. Your information is invaluable. As the day wore on, Miss Marple's quiet inquiries began to reveal a pattern. Sims was the key figure weaving through many tangled threads. His past was murky, and his motives remained veiled in shadows. Later, she found herself at the vicarage, speaking with Reverend George Milner, a man whose gentle faith and respect in the community lent him an air of moral authority. The Reverend listened thoughtfully as Miss Marple outlined what she had learned. I fear, she said softly, that there are those among us willing to silence anyone who threatens to expose long-buried sins. Reverend Milner sighed heavily. Such darkness is a heavy burden for a small village, but light can pierce even the deepest shadow if one is steadfast. Miss Marple smiled gently. Indeed, that is why I believe the truth will come out, no matter how fiercely it is guarded. The evening brought a surprise visitor to Miss Marple's door, Evelyn Collett, her face pale and drawn. Miss Marple, I fear I am in danger. Last night I received a note warning me to stop asking questions about Lavinia and Harold. I don't know what to do. Miss Marple took Evelyn's hand reassuringly. You must be careful, but do not be afraid. Together, we will see this through. Evelyn nodded, grateful for the support. As the night deepened once again, Miss Marple reflected on the precarious balance of much Combly. The threads of loyalty, fear, and ambition wove a tapestry that was as fragile as it was complex. Somewhere within this web lurked the murderer, watching, waiting, and ready to strike again if necessary. She resolved to confront the next day with vigilance and patience, knowing that often it was in the smallest details, an overlooked glance, a hesitation in speech, that the truth revealed itself. The village held its breath, caught between past and present, innocence and guilt, while Miss Marple prepared for the subtle dance of observation and deduction that would ultimately unmask the killer. The following morning dawned grey and mist-laden, as though much Combly itself wished to shroud the day's events in secrecy. Miss Marple, however, was resolute. Her mind had never been clearer, the whispered warnings only sharpening her determination. The ledger, the threatening note, the shadow of Mr. Sims, all these were threads in a tangled skein she was now intent on unraveling. After a brief breakfast, she received a message from Constable Cummings. He requested her presence at the village hall, where a gathering of concerned townsfolk had convened at the request of the local magistrate. The urgency in his note suggested that matters were reaching a critical juncture. Arriving at the hall, Miss Marple found the room filled with an assortment of villagers, farmers, shopkeepers, and the usual cadre of curious onlookers. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with speculation and unease. At the center stood Inspector Harrington, the official police representative, who greeted Miss Marple with a nod of acknowledgement. "Miss Marple," he began briskly, "thank you for coming. I'm afraid the situation has taken a grave turn." She inclined her head, the hint of a knowing smile playing about her lips. "Please, Inspector, do tell." "It appears someone has attempted to destroy evidence." Harrington's eyes scanned the room, resting momentarily on several familiar faces before continuing. "Last night, the ledger Harold Smeaton entrusted to us was stolen from the safe in the magistrate's office. We suspect this was an inside job." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, absorbing the implications. "Have you any suspects?" she asked softly. Inspector Harrington hesitated. "Nothing concrete yet, but we are conducting interviews and searching for the thief. This theft suggests that the stakes are higher than we initially thought." Miss Marple considered this carefully. The ledger was the linchpin. Without it, any case would crumble. Whoever stole it was desperate to keep the past buried. As the meeting dispersed, Miss Marple was approached by Evelyn Collett. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Miss Marple, I received another note last night. It warned me to stay silent, or worse would follow." Miss Marple squeezed Evelyn's hand gently. "You must not be intimidated. I will do everything in my power to protect you." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple invited Evelyn to her home, where the two could speak freely. As Evelyn recounted her recent experiences, Miss Marple's mind pieced together a growing pattern of intimidation and deception. Suddenly, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Constable Cummings entered, his face grave. "Miss Marple, there's been an incident at the manor." "Do tell," she said, rising. "It seems someone tried to force their way into the Halbert estate last night. The household staff caught a shadowy figure near the west wing and managed to scare them off. No one was harmed, but the audacity is troubling." Miss Marple nodded. "The attacker was likely searching for something, perhaps the ledger or other incriminating documents." Evelyn paled. "They're coming closer." Miss Marple set her jaw. "Then we must act swiftly." She resolved to pay another visit to the manor, this time with the tacit approval of Inspector Harrington. The sprawling estate was imposing even in its quietude, with the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. Mrs. Jenkins, the housekeeper, met Miss Marple at the door, her eyes wary. "Miss Marple, thank goodness you're here. The staff are on edge after last night." Miss Marple smiled reassuringly. "I understand. May I see the West Wing?" The housekeeper led her through dimly lit corridors, the faint scent of lavender and polished wood lingering in the air. At the end of a narrow hallway, they arrived at a door secured with a sturdy lock. Mrs. Jenkins produced a key and opened it, revealing a small study lined with bookshelves. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room quickly. There was no sign of forced entry, but the arrangement of the furniture had been subtly disturbed. A chair was slightly askew, a book lay open on the desk with its pages ruffled, and on the floor near the fireplace was a faint smudge of muddy boot print. "This room was clearly searched," Miss Marple observed, "but the intruder left in haste." Mrs. Jenkins wrung her hands. "We keep no secrets here, Miss Marple. What could they possibly be after?" Miss Marple's gaze returned to the desk. Among the scattered papers lay a single folded note, hastily discarded. She picked it up carefully, unfolding it to reveal a cryptic message. "Truth lies not in the ledger alone. Look beyond the surface, where the past and present collide." The note offered no signature, but its meaning was clear. There was more to uncover, deeper secrets buried beneath the known. Miss Marple returned home with a new resolve. The threat was real, and the stakes were mounting. She knew the next step would require subtlety, a psychological test to unsettle the true culprit. That evening, she invited several key villagers for tea, including Evelyn Collett, Dr. Fellows, and even the reticent Mr. Barnaby, the local solicitor who had been quietly involved in managing the Colonel's estate. As they settled in the cozy sitting room, Miss Marple began to speak in her usual gentle manner, weaving casual conversation with pointed questions designed to probe their reactions. She mentioned the ledger, the theft, and the recent break-in without accusing anyone directly. Instead, she observed expressions, shifts in posture, and the smallest gestures, an averted glance, a tightening grip on a teacup, a hesitation in speech. Dr. Fellows seemed composed, yet Miss Marple noted a flicker of unease when the ledger was mentioned. Mr. Barnaby, normally guarded, appeared slightly agitated, his eyes narrowing as Miss Marple referred to unsettling secrets hidden in plain sight. Evelyn, meanwhile, clung quietly to her teacup, her hands trembling faintly but her gaze steady. The test was unfolding. Later, after the guests had departed, Miss Marple sat alone by the fire, reflecting on the evening. The delicate dance of observation had yielded subtle clues. Dr. Fellows's discomfort suggested knowledge beyond what he admitted. Mr. Barnaby's agitation hinted at personal stakes, and Evelyn's courage in the face of threats was unwavering. She resolved to confront these threats carefully, knowing that the true murderer's mask was beginning to slip. Meanwhile, in a dark corner of much Combley, a figure watched from the shadows, lips curling into a thin smile. The game was far from over, and the next move would decide the fate of all involved. Miss Marple was ready. The early morning mist clung to the hedgerows as Miss Marple set out once more for the village, her footsteps soft upon the damp earth. The events of the previous evening stirred in her mind. Dr. Fellows's flicker of unease, Mr. Barnaby's barely concealed agitation, and the quiet strength of Evelyn Collett. Each revealed a thread, slender but taut, in the tangled web she sought to unravel. She paused briefly outside the village post office, watching as the daily bustle unfolded. Villagers exchanging greetings, a few whispering furtively in corners. Much Combley remained outwardly unchanged, yet beneath this veneer, the tension was palpable. Her first visit was to Dr. Fellows's surgery. The doctor was already at work, attending to a patient, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise at her arrival. Miss Marple waited patiently until the consultation ended, then stepped inside. "Good morning, doctor," she began, her tone light yet probing. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Miss Marple," he replied, managing a courteous smile. "How may I assist you today?" "I wanted to follow up on our conversation regarding the ledger and Colonel Halbert's affairs. You appeared troubled last night during our tea." Dr. Fellows sighed, removing his spectacles. "The Colonel was a dear friend, and his passing has left many questions unanswered. I confess there are details I withheld, matters I feared might cause unnecessary pain." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Pain often lingers in silence. Would you care to share what you know?" He hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "The ledger contains entries that implicate several village dignitaries in questionable dealings, not only financial but personal. There was a pressure on me to remain silent, threats subtle but unmistakable." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Pressure can reveal the true measure of a person's character. Were these threats from someone close to the Colonel's inner circle? "Indeed. I believe the solicitor, Mr. Barnaby, has been involved more deeply than he admits." The mention of Barnaby brought a flicker of recognition to Miss Marple's expression. "Thank you, Doctor. Your honesty is appreciated." She left the surgery with a clearer picture of the dangers lurking beneath Much Combley's polite surface. Next, she visited Mr. Barnaby's chambers, a modest office lined with legal tomes and a faint aroma of leather-bound volumes. The solicitor greeted her with an air of controlled civility, though a shadow flickered in his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said smoothly, "to what do I owe this unexpected call?" "I wish to discuss the Colonel's estate," she replied calmly. "And the ledger?" Barnaby's lips tightened imperceptibly. "I am afraid I cannot comment on private affairs." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Of course. But might you tell me if there has been any recent activity, perhaps unusual correspondence or visits, to the manor?" He hesitated, then admitted, "There have been inquiries, yes, from a gentleman named Sims, though I understand he has left the village." She pressed gently. "And these inquiries, do they concern the ledger or something else?" Barnaby's composure faltered for a moment. "I cannot say." The conversation left Miss Marple with a sense of unease. Barnaby's evasiveness hinted at secrets he preferred buried. Later that day, Miss Marple invited Evelyn Collett for a walk along the village lanes, hoping the fresh air might ease the young woman's anxieties. Evelyn's gratitude was evident, and as they strolled beneath the budding branches, she confided fears that someone was watching her, waiting to silence any further questions. Miss Marple listened intently. "Fear can cloud judgment, but it can also sharpen the senses. Tell me, Evelyn, did you notice anything unusual the day before the fete? Any stranger or strange behavior?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "Yes. I saw Mr. Sims speaking with Lavinia Halbert near the old chapel ruins. They seemed tense, almost secretive." "That is valuable," Miss Marple replied. "The ruins are often overlooked, a perfect place for hushed conversations." As they returned to the village, Miss Marple's mind was alive with connections. The hidden meeting, the threatening notes, the stolen ledger, it all hinted at a conspiracy woven through personal relationships as much as financial deceit. That evening, she received a summons from Inspector Harrington, who had discovered a new piece of evidence. A letter, unsigned and hastily written, found in the possession of a local handyman, implicated someone unexpected. Miss Marple met the inspector at the police station. "This letter," Harrington explained, "claims that the real motive behind the murder lies in a secret that predates even Colonel Halbert's arrival in Muchcomble. It suggests that the victim uncovered this secret, prompting the fatal confrontation." Miss Marple examined the letter carefully. The handwriting was shaky, and the words hinted at long-held grudges and family feuds concealed beneath generations of civility. "The past, it seems, refuses to stay buried," Miss Marple mused. Days passed with mounting tension. Miss Marple arranged a discreet gathering at her home, inviting key figures under the guise of a simple tea party. Her aim was to observe, to unsettle the fragile composure of those who might hide culpability behind polite smiles. As the guests arrived, polite conversation flowed, but beneath the surface, currents shifted. Miss Marple gently steered dialogue toward the themes of trust and betrayal, watching closely for the smallest telltale signs. Dr. Fellows fidgeted when the topic of hidden secrets arose. Mr. Barnaby avoided eye contact as Miss Marple mentioned the possibility of a long-standing vendetta. Evelyn maintained a quiet dignity, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of hope. Then, as if drawn by an unseen cue, the conversation paused when a sudden knock came at the door. Constable Cummings entered, breathless. "Miss Marple, a body has been found at the chapel ruins." The room fell into stunned silence. Miss Marple rose steadily. "We must go at once." At the ruins, the scene was grim but revealing. The body lay partially concealed beneath ivy and moss. An older man, unmistakably the local handyman. His face was peaceful, but the cause of death was evident. A single, precise blow to the head. Nearby lay a crumpled photograph, depicting a young Lavinia Halbert standing beside a man whose resemblance to the handyman was unmistakable. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. The hidden history was beginning to surface in full. "Who found him?" she asked quietly. "A passer-by on an early morning walk," Constable Cummings replied. Miss Marple knelt beside the body, noting the careful placement of the photograph. "This was meant to send a message. The killer wishes to remind us of past ties, of debts unpaid." As dawn broke fully over Muchcomble, the village awoke to the grim realization that the mystery was deeper, darker, and far more tangled than any of them had dared to imagine. The murder was no longer an isolated event. It was the culmination of years of buried secrets, intersecting lives, and bitter grievances. Miss Marple felt the weight of it all settle upon her, but her eyes gleamed with quiet resolve. The pieces were falling into place, and soon the true story would be told, not through whispers or threats, but by the steady light of truth that only patience and understanding could reveal. The discovery of the handyman's body beneath the ivy-clad stones of the old chapel ruins sent a ripple of shock through Muchcomble. Yet, to Miss Marple, the grim scene was less a surprise than a confirmation. The hidden past was emerging at last, unbidden but unstoppable. She had long sensed that the murder of Colonel Halbert was only a chapter in a far deeper story, and now the layers of deception were peeling back with chilling clarity. The village had become a tinderbox, and every glance and whispered word carried weight. Miss Marple found herself summoned once more to the police station, where Inspector Harrington awaited with fresh information gleaned from the investigation into the handyman's death. "Miss Marple," he began. "The autopsy confirms blunt force trauma as the cause of death, consistent with a heavy object. But there's something else. The victim's pockets contained fragments of a torn letter. We've managed to piece together most of it." He handed over the reconstructed note, its jagged edges lending it an air of urgency. The message was cryptic, but unmistakably connected to the ancient grievances hinted at before. The truth buried in blood, the debt owed in silence. Beware those who wear the mask of friend. Miss Marple read it carefully, noting the deliberate choice of words. The message was clearly meant as a warning, to reveal that someone close was not what they appeared. Her thoughts drifted back to the photograph found by the body. Lavinia Halberd, young and serene, standing beside a man unmistakably the handyman, a figure she now recognized as Thomas Weir, a man with a shadowed history in much Combly. What ties bound Lavinia to Thomas Weir, and why had their connection been so zealously concealed? Determined to learn more, Miss Marple decided to visit Lavinia's cottage that afternoon. The weather had cleared, and a soft sun filtered through the lace curtains as she was shown into a tidy sitting room adorned with embroidery and family photographs. Lavinia herself was present, a delicate woman whose pale eyes bore the weight of secrets. She greeted Miss Marple with a quiet dignity but a flicker of apprehension. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I'm afraid the past has caught up with me, though I hoped it would remain buried." Miss Marple settled into a chair, folding her hands calmly. "Sometimes, Miss Halberd, the past must be faced to make way for truth and healing. May I ask about Thomas Weir?" Lavinia's fingers trembled as she took a delicate handkerchief. "Thomas was my father's old friend, though not all in the village regarded him kindly. He was a man who carried many burdens, some of which we only understood after his death." "What burdens?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Lavinia hesitated. "Years ago, Thomas discovered a secret about my family, a secret that some wanted to keep hidden at any cost. He intended to speak out, but fear and threats silenced him. The ledger, it was more than just numbers. It recorded promises broken, alliances forged in shadow." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And you believe this secret led to both the Colonel's murder and now Thomas's death?" Lavinia's voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, I fear the same hands that silenced Thomas are still at work." Miss Marple's mind raced, recalling the furtive glances and uneasy words from previous conversations. It was clear now that the motive was not merely personal, but entwined with a legacy of betrayal and fear. That evening, as dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple invited the key figures once again to her home for tea. The gathering was quiet, each guest keenly aware that the circle was tightening. The subtle interplay of suspicion and fear made the air thick with unspoken truth. Miss Marple engaged them in gentle conversation, weaving her questions carefully, encouraging the revelation of hidden emotions. Her eyes lingered on Mr. Barnaby, whose usual composure was now noticeably strained. "As we reflect on the events that have shaken much Combly," she said softly, "it is clear that old wounds still bleed beneath the surface. Sometimes the greatest betrayals come from those we trust the most." Mr. Barnaby shifted uneasily but said nothing. Turning to Dr. Fellows, Miss Marple asked, "Doctor, in your many years among us, have you ever encountered such deep-rooted secrets that one would kill to protect them?" The doctor's face darkened. "Unfortunately, yes. Loyalty can become chains, and silence can be a prison." Miss Marple smiled faintly, then addressed the room. "We all wear masks, but they slip, even if only for a moment." Just then, the doorbell rang sharply, breaking the fragile stillness. Constable Cummings entered, carrying a small leather-bound notebook. "Miss Marple, we found this in the gardener's shed at the Halberd estate. It appears to be a journal belonging to the late Colonel." She took the book and flipped through the pages. The colonel's handwriting was precise but tense. Entries detailed meetings, whispered conversations, and coded references to promises and debts owed. One passage caught her eye. Trust no one but Evelyn. The ledger is only part of the story. The true danger lies with those who will kill to keep their secrets safe. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Evelyn Collett had been steadfast and brave throughout the ordeal. Was she now in greater peril than ever? The guests exchanged glances, the weight of the revelation settling heavily upon them. The next morning, Miss Marple accompanied Inspector Harrington to Evelyn's home. They found her in the garden, tending the roses with quiet focus. She greeted them with a smile that belied the storm in sight. "Miss Marple," Evelyn said, "I feared this day would come, but I cannot keep silent any longer." She revealed that, in the days before Colonel Halbert's death, she had uncovered discrepancies in the village's land records, discrepancies implicating several prominent families, including the Halberts and others who had profited at the expense of less fortunate villagers. Her discovery had placed her squarely in the path of those who sought to protect their wealth and reputation by any means necessary. Miss Marple listened closely as Evelyn described a recent confrontation with a shadowy figure who had warned her to abandon her inquiries. "Do you believe this person is among those we have spoken to?" Miss Marple asked. Evelyn nodded. "Yes, and I fear the next step will be more dangerous." Miss Marple exchanged a look with Inspector Harrington, who was already making notes. The investigation was now at a critical threshold. It was time for Miss Marple's final test, to unmask the killer by provoking the subtle reaction that only truth can elicit. That evening, she arranged for the main suspects to meet once more in her sitting room. The atmosphere was charged with quiet tension, the players uncertain yet unwilling to show their hands fully. Miss Marple began speaking in her usual soft voice, weaving a story that touched on trust, betrayal, and the consequences of hidden sins. Her gaze locked with Mr. Barnaby's when she recounted the story of a man who wore the mask of loyalty but hid poison beneath. Barnaby's fingers tightened around his teacup, his voice faltering when he spoke of honor. Dr. Fellows shifted uneasily as Miss Marple described the pain of secrets kept too long. Finally, she turned to Evelyn, praising her courage and honesty, subtly signaling that the scales were tipping. As the evening progressed, the room's tension grew palpable until, at last, a small but telling slip, a flicker of anger, a momentary glance, a hesitating word, betrayed the true culprit. Miss Marple rose, calm and composed. The murder of Colonel Halbert and the death of Thomas Weir were acts born not only of fear, but of desperate attempts to silence the past. The ledger, the threats, the stolen evidence, all were pieces of a larger puzzle, one tied to greed, betrayal, and the cruel need to protect a reputation. Her eyes rested on the man whose mask had slipped, Mr. Barnaby. "You sought to conceal your involvement in fraudulent dealings, using threats and violence to keep your secrets safe. But in doing so, you sowed the seeds of your own undoing." Barnaby's face paled as the room held its breath. Miss Marple smiled gently but resolutely. "Justice is not always swift, but it is inevitable." As the constables moved to take Barnaby into custody, the village seemed to exhale a collective sigh, relief mingled with sorrow. Much Comblé would never quite be the same, but the shadows that had haunted it were at last brought into the light. Miss Marple, seated once again by her fire, reflected quietly on the fragile nature of trust and the depths of human complexity. In the small village she called home, the mask of civility had been pierced, revealing the truth beneath. And as always, Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with the quiet satisfaction of a mystery solved, a story told, and justice served. The late afternoon sun slanted softly through the mullioned windows of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the tangled threads of the mystery now drawing to its close. The gathered villagers sat in an uneasy circle, the air thick with anticipation, and the unspoken question lingering between them all. Who had been clever enough, and ruthless enough, to orchestrate the murders that had shattered their peaceful village? Miss Marple, with her customary quiet dignity, rose from her favorite armchair and glanced around the room. "Thank you all for coming," she began gently. "This long and painful story has revealed much about the nature of secrets, trust, and betrayal in our community, but now it is time to lay bare the truth." She let her eyes settle briefly on each face, the wary, the guarded, the grief-stricken, before she continued. "When Colonel Halberd was murdered, it seemed the crime was rooted in old family disputes and financial misdeeds. But there was more, hidden beneath layers of deception, carefully obscured by those who wished to protect their reputations." Miss Marple's voice softened, her tone deliberate yet kind. The ledger, the threats, the cryptic letters, they all pointed to a desperate attempt to keep the past silent. Yet it was not only greed or fear that motivated the crime, but the desire to control the narrative of a history too shameful to face openly. She paused, watching as murmurs rippled quietly. Thomas Weir's death, though seemingly a separate tragedy, was in fact the final piece. He had uncovered what others tried to bury. A record of betrayals and lies stretching back decades, implicating more than one of our respected villagers. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, and a subtle but knowing smile touched her lips. It was the unassuming Mr. Barnaby who wore the mask most convincingly. His polished exterior and calm demeanor concealed a man desperate to protect himself from ruin. When confronted with the evidence, he resorted to silencing those who threatened his carefully constructed facade. The room held its breath. His slip was subtle, too subtle for anyone but the most attentive observer. A flicker of anger when Evelyn Collitor spoke of justice, a hesitation when the ledger's significance was mentioned, and a careless mention of details only the murderer could know. These small cracks in his story led me here. Mr. Barnaby's face drained of color. "You have no proof," he protested weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Proof is often less important than human nature. The truth reveals itself in the smallest of gestures, in the shadows cast by our words and actions, and in much combly, justice will now be served." As the constables moved to take Barnaby into custody, a hush fell over the room, broken only by Evelyn's quiet sigh of relief. Miss Marple turned to the others, her expression serene. "The village will heal, though some scars will remain. And we must remember that beneath the surface of civility lies a complexity of human emotions, capable of both kindness and cruelty." Later, alone by her fireside, Miss Marple reflected on the case. She knew that the masks people wore were many, and that sometimes it took patience and empathy to see beyond them. In much Combly, as always, the quiet wisdom of observation and understanding had prevailed. The village had returned to its peaceful rhythms, but the lessons of this dark chapter lingered. A reminder that the truth, however well concealed, would always find its way to the light.